They called it just another Tuesday night in Hollywood. But under those blistering studio lights, it was never just another show. It was the night a late-night king underestimated the wrong guest. The studio lights at Jimmy Kimmel Live were unforgiving, pouring heat onto the stage with the precision of 1,000 suns. The audience had filed in with the expectation of laughter, applause, and maybe a viral clip to talk about the next morning. They were there for entertainment, not history. But history has a way of slipping in, through the cracks when ego collides with pride, and when two men with very different Hollywood legacies are forced to share the same stage. Mark Wahlberg entered with the presence of a man who knew his worth, dressed sharp, jawline set like stone. He didn't just walk onto that stage, he claimed it. For decades, Wahlberg had been Hollywood's contradiction. A tough guy with commercial bankability, an action star with the instincts of a producer, a former street kid who had clawed his way up to A-list respectability. He wasn't just promoting another film. He was representing his craft, his discipline, and the kind of work ethic that wakes at 4 a.m. to train while the rest of Hollywood is still sleeping off champagne. The crowd greeted him with cheers, a wave of recognition for the man who had carried franchises, built businesses, and survived the kind of career pitfalls that would have buried anyone with less resilience. To the public, Mark Wahlberg was not just an actor. He was proof that reinvention was possible, that grit could outlast scandal. And then, opposite him, sat Jimmy Kimmel. The late-night host, armed with a microphone and a grin sharpened by years of trading in sarcasm, carried his own kind of authority. He was Hollywood's reigning comedy king, the man who turned awkward silences into punchlines and celebrity vulnerabilities into viral moments. Kimmel was beloved by fans who craved his quick wit, his irreverence, his ability to roast even the most untouchable stars. But behind that charm was a different reputation, an insider's awareness that Kimmel thrived on gotcha journalism, ambush humor dressed up as late-night banter. The contrast could not have been more cinematic. On one side, Wahlberg prepared to honor the work, the film, the craft. On the other, Kimmel prepared to mine the moment for laughs, no matter who became the punchline. As the band played and the applause faded, the atmosphere hummed with expectancy. Wahlberg leaned forward, ready to talk about his movie, the team that had labored alongside him, the artistry often overlooked when it comes to action cinema. He was ready to play the role of gracious guest, a Hollywood veteran who knew the mechanics of the press tour and respected the ritual. But Kimmel had no interest in rituals. For him, the stage was a throne, and his guests were pawns in the nightly game of comedy chess. He had built a career on pushing buttons, on teasing the cracks in celebrity armor until something raw slipped through. His studio wasn't just a place for promotion, it was an arena. And tonight, he believed he had the perfect opponent. The tension was invisible to most at first, hidden beneath applause and small talk. But to those who had been around Hollywood long enough, the signs were clear. Kimmel's smile was just a little too sharp. Wahlberg's posture was just a little too guarded. The green room camaraderie had evaporated the second the cameras turned red. What the audience didn't yet know was that they were about to witness something extraordinary, the collision of comedy, arrogance, and working-class authenticity. One man armed with a desk, a camera crew, and millions watching at home. The other armed only with his story, his dignity, and the kind of lived experience no joke could diminish. It should have been another easy night in late-night television. A celebrity guest comes in, plays along, endures a few light jabs, and plugs the movie. The machine churns, the ratings hold steady, and tomorrow Hollywood goes back to business as usual. But business as usual was not on the menu that night. Instead, under the glare of those blistering lights and the weight of an audience ready to laugh, Jimmy Kimmel would make a single calculated misstep, a comment meant to humiliate, not to amuse. And in that instant, Hollywood's golden stage would turn sour, unraveling into one of the most unforgettable confrontations ever broadcast on late-night television. The fuse had been lit. All that remained was the explosion. The band's last notes faded into the background, and for a heartbeat, the studio felt weightless, suspended in that familiar rhythm of talk show ritual. Then Jimmy Kimmel leaned in, smile fixed like armor, and dropped the first strike. "So, Mark," he said, voice dripping with mock warmth, "how does it feel being Hollywood's most overpaid tough guy?" The words landed like glass shattering on marble. The audience, primed to laugh on cue, faltered. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. This wasn't a playful jab, not the kind of tease that late-night audiences had been conditioned to clap for. It was sharper, meaner, and loaded with a weight no laugh track could carry. Silence. The kind that gnaws at the edges of a room. Someone coughed. A camera operator shifted uncomfortably. The air conditioner hummed louder than it should have. The entire studio seemed to lean in, waiting for Wahlberg to either fold or fight. On the surface, it looked like a joke, but in Hollywood, nothing said on camera is ever just a joke. This was a calculated move, the classic gotcha question disguised as comedy. Kimmel had carved his niche by making guests squirm, by reducing decades of work to a single punchline. And tonight he thought he'd found the perfect soundbite. Mark Wahlberg, the muscle-bound movie star, exposed as nothing more than a walking paycheck. It was a power play, pure and simple. The late-night host wielded his platform like a weapon, banking on the audience's laughter to cement his dominance. In his mind, Wahlberg was supposed to chuckle awkwardly, brush it off, and then shuffle into promotion mode. That was the script. That was the game. But Wahlberg didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, yes, but his eyes stayed locked, calm yet unyielding. He didn't snap back with a defensive quip. He didn't let the silence suffocate him. Instead, he wore the kind of composure that only comes from years of surviving tougher battles than a comedian with a desk. For Wahlberg, this wasn't just about one insult. It was about something deeper, about every time he'd been dismissed as a pretty face, every headline that reduced him to a paycheck, every whisper in Hollywood that questioned whether his career was built on grit or gimmick. The storm was brewing behind his steady gaze, and though the audience couldn't hear it yet, they could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. Kimmel had thrown his punch, but Wahlberg wasn't crumbling. He was calculating, waiting. The studio, once primed for laughter, was now a pressure cooker, and everyone in that room sensed what was coming. Mark Wahlberg didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His response came measured, precise, like a fighter who knows exactly when to strike. "Easy life," he said. His words cut through the silence, low and steady. Try getting up at 4 a.m. every day. Try training for months. Try doing your own stunts while people sit behind a desk making jokes about other people's work. The studio temperature shifted. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a statement of war. Wahlberg had taken the insult meant to shrink him and flipped it into a declaration of his worth. Every syllable carried weight because it came from lived reality. Wahlberg wasn't just reciting a schedule. He was laying bare the sacrifices beneath the glossy veneer of stardom. The early mornings, the punishing workouts, the injuries, the years of staying disciplined in an industry built on excess. For him, the grind wasn't optional. It was survival. And beneath his calm delivery was something deeper, defiance against a Hollywood stereotype that had shadowed him for decades. To many insiders, Wahlberg was the blueprint of the tough guy actor, the muscle, the scowl, the box office draw. A role that paid well but came at a price. The industry loved to slot men like him into a box. Disposable action stars, easy to mock, rarely respected for their craft. Kimmel's joke had tapped directly into that wound. And instead of laughing along, Wahlberg cracked the stereotype open, showing the humanity behind the muscle. He wasn't reacting to Jimmy Kimmel alone. He was reacting to an entire system that had underestimated him, dismissed him, and dared to call his work easy. The audience could feel it. This wasn't the playful banter they'd been promised when they filed into the studio. This was raw, authentic, a man refusing to be the punchline in someone else's comedy sketch. You could see it in the faces of the crowd, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others nodding quietly, as if Wahlberg's words mirrored their own private struggles. Behind the cameras, the crew froze. Operators held their shots longer than usual. Producers whispered frantically into headsets. They all knew they were no longer filming a routine interview. They were capturing the moment, the kind of unscripted television that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered. Wahlberg leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Kimmel, his tone unwavering. It wasn't aggression. It was conviction, the kind that comes from a man who has had to fight for every inch of respect, every dollar earned, every role not handed to him, but clawed from the jaws of Hollywood doubt. For the first time that night, Jimmy Kimmel didn't look like the man in control. He looked cornered, outclassed. The throne of late-night comedy no longer seemed quite so secure. And the audience knew it. They weren't watching a guest survive an interview. They were watching a guest seize it. The counterpunch had landed, and the balance of power on that stage would never be the same again. Jimmy Kimmel had built his career on making celebrities squirm. But now it was him shifting in his chair, his grin starting to crack. He tried to laugh off Wahlberg's counterpunch, his voice a little too high-pitched, his timing just a little too slow. "Whoa, whoa," Kimmel said, fingers drumming nervously on the desk. Somebody's getting a little defensive. It was meant to reset the mood, to bring the audience back on his side. But the air in the studio had already changed. The tension wasn't playful anymore. Every time Kimmel tried to steer things back to comedy, Wahlberg's steady gaze pulled the moment back to reality. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, grasping for authority. "I'm just saying," he continued, "not everyone gets handed movie roles because they have nice muscles." The words dropped heavy, and this time there was no mistaking the intent. This wasn't banter. This was a shot at credibility, a dismissal of Wahlberg's entire career. The audience froze, caught between the expectation to laugh and the dawning realization that their host had just crossed a line. Wahlberg sat forward, his expression sharpening. The heat in his eyes was unmistakable, but his voice stayed calm. Controlled fury, the kind that unnerves more than shouting ever could. "Hand it to me," he said, slow, deliberate. "Are you serious right now? Do you know what I was doing when I was 15 years old? I wasn't auditioning. I wasn't at some fancy school. I was on the streets trying to survive." The words landed with the force of lived experience. Wahlberg didn't need to embellish. His history was public record. Arrests, fights, the kind of mistakes that come from growing up with nothing but desperation and bad choices. But the power wasn't in the confession itself. It was in the contrast. "While you were probably in college," Wahlberg continued, his tone sharpening, "learning how to make fun of people for a living, I was figuring out how not to get killed. And every single thing I have today I fought for." The silence in the room thickened. Audience members shifted in their seats, uneasy but riveted. A few nodded, recognizing the raw truth in Wahlberg's words. Others stared at Kimmel, waiting for him to recover, to pull the show back from the cliff he had steered it toward. But Kimmel couldn't. His usual smirk looked forced now. The power he had wielded so easily in 1,000 interviews was slipping, and he knew it. What had started as a roast had become something else entirely, an attempted character assassination dressed up as comedy. And Wahlberg wasn't playing along. Psychologically, the roles had reversed. Wahlberg, once the guest expected to absorb humiliation, had become the dominant force. His calm intensity commanded the room, while Kimmel, once untouchable behind his desk, looked cornered, diminished. Every movement betrayed nerves, the restless tapping of his pen, the way his eyes flicked toward the producers offstage, searching for rescue. This was the moment the mask slipped. In late night, the roast is supposed to be playful, a dance where both sides understand the rules. But Kimmel broke the pact. He went personal. He tried to reduce Wahlberg to a stereotype, a body with no brain, a paycheck with no substance. And in doing so, he revealed not just arrogance, but fear. Fear of losing control of his stage. Fear of being outclassed by a man who wasn't supposed to fight back. Mark Wahlberg didn't need to shout to prove his point. His composure was the sharpest weapon in the room. Every word came like a blade against Kimmel's carefully constructed image. And for the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel's laughter wasn't enough to save him. The line had been crossed. The roast was over. And what remained was something far more dangerous: truth. Live and unfiltered under the hot glare of Hollywood's most merciless lights. The weight of the room had shifted. What began as a late-night skirmish was now something entirely different. Jimmy Kimmel's desk no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a barrier he was hiding behind. And across from him, Mark Wahlberg wasn't just defending himself. He was taking control of the entire stage. He leaned forward, voice steady, eyes unblinking. "You invite me on your show and then disrespect everything I've worked for. You think because you have a microphone and a studio audience that gives you the right to tear people down?" The audience held its breath. This wasn't rage, not the unhinged outburst Kimmel had been baiting for. It was something far more dangerous. It was measured, articulate, devastating. Wahlberg had flipped the script. rewriting the rules of the room in real time. He wasn't the butt of the roast anymore. He was the author of a masterclass in restraint and truth. "I've been acting for over 20 years, he said, each line building like a drumbeat. "I've produced films, built businesses, tried to give back to my community, and you sit there and tell me I don't deserve what I've earned?" The message hit harder than any punchline. Acting wasn't some vanity project, it was a grind. 16-hour shoot days, months of training, rewrites, reshoots, endless scrutiny. Every movie meant jobs, livelihoods, reputations on the line. Wahlberg wasn't bragging. He was lifting the curtain on a profession people mocked but didn't understand. Then his focus widened. "You know what really gets me?" he asked. "It's not even about me. It's about the young actors, the ones who have to sit in chairs like this, swallow the insults, and laugh it off just to get their shot." The room shifted. A ripple passed through the audience. Some leaned forward, phones raised, realizing this wasn't just late-night TV anymore. It was something bigger, a reckoning. A star refusing to play the clown, standing up for everyone who'd ever been cornered behind a smile. Behind the cameras, producers panicked. The clip was already gone, escaping into the digital wild before they could contain it. Within minutes it would be everywhere: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. The headline would write itself: "Mark Wahlberg shuts down Jimmy Kimmel live." And the more Wahlberg spoke, the more undeniable it became. This wasn't anger. It was principle. "There's a difference," he said, voice steady, "between comedy and cruelty. Between poking fun and tearing people down. What you're doing, that's cruelty. That's punching down." The crowd didn't laugh. They listened. Phones glowed like a constellation in the darkened studio, capturing every flicker of Kimmel's unraveling composure and Wahlberg's quiet dominance. The shift was total. What began as a roast had turned into a lesson. Wahlberg had redrawn the boundaries of late-night TV, proving that respect is the one currency Hollywood can't counterfeit. Across from him, Kimmel was coming apart. Sweat shimmered under the lights. His hand clutched the coffee mug like it was an anchor. The grin that usually carried him through controversy was gone, replaced by something small: fear. And then, in a flash of desperation, Kimmel made the mistake that would follow him for the rest of his career. "You think you're better than me, Mark?" he snapped, his voice breaking. "Everyone knows about your past. Everyone knows you were a thug before you were an actor." The studio froze. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was an execution attempt. Personal, ugly, final. Wahlberg didn't flinch. His expression barely changed, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "There it is," he said quietly. "The real Jimmy Kimmel. When the jokes fail, you go straight for the personal attack." The air thickened. Suddenly it wasn't Wahlberg under scrutiny, it was Kimmel. His arrogance laid bare for millions to see. "Yes, I made mistakes," Wahlberg continued. "Serious ones. I hurt people, but I faced them. I owned them. I apologized. I've spent my life trying to make up for it. That's what being a man looks like." The contrast was brutal. On one side, a man who'd fallen, rebuilt, and evolved. On the other, a man hiding behind a desk, mistaking cruelty for wit. Kimmel tried to interject, voice cracking. "Mark, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Wahlberg cut in, sharp and steady. "You've been waiting to use that. Waiting for the perfect moment to bring up my past, hoping I'd lose control so you could turn it into a punchline. But here's the thing, Jimmy. My past doesn't define me anymore. What you just did? That defines you." The audience sat in stunned silence, no longer an audience, but witnesses. Some filmed through trembling hands, aware they were watching a moment that would echo across the industry. Late night had just changed forever. Others sat frozen, unable to look away from the slow collapse of a man once untouchable in late-night television. Kimmel's mask had fallen. His eyes shimmered under the studio lights, the glint of tears betraying him. The confident host was gone. What remained was a man stripped of control, cornered by his own words. "I didn't mean to destroy anyone," he said quietly, voice trembling. Wahlberg's reply was calm, surgical. "Then what did you mean to do? Make me look stupid? Feed your ego at my expense? Don't insult my intelligence, Jimmy. You crossed the line. You didn't tell a joke. You tried to assassinate my character in front of millions. That's not comedy. That's cruelty." The shift was complete. Wahlberg wasn't the guest anymore. He was the authority, the man holding court. And Kimmel, once the master of the room, now sat as the defendant, visibly unraveling. The cameras caught every detail, his shaking hands, his shallow breaths, his eyes darting away from the man across the table. This was the kind of live television that couldn't be edited, couldn't be spun. For Wahlberg, it was redemption, a reclamation of his story. For Kimmel, it was the fatal blow. One calculated jab had detonated his own empire. The silence that followed was unbearable. The audience, wide-eyed, seemed to grasp what Hollywood would soon realize. Jimmy Kimmel's throne had never been built on humor. It was built on arrogance. And that night, under the hottest lights in the industry, arrogance imploded. Wahlberg had said enough. The cameras, the crowd, the millions watching, it all fell away. Only one thing mattered now, respect. And he wasn't about to trade his for applause. He reached down and unclipped his microphone, every motion deliberate. The audience watched in rapt silence, phones still raised. In the wings, producers gestured frantically, realizing there was no saving the broadcast. This wasn't a bad segment, it was a career burning in real time. "Mark, please don't leave," Kimmel stammered. "We can fix this. We can edit it." Wahlberg placed the mic gently on the table between them. The simple gesture hit harder than a tirade. "You want to cover it up?" he asked softly. "Pretend it never happened? That's your solution. But that's not mine." It was a line that would echo far beyond that studio. Wahlberg wasn't storming off. He was walking away with purpose. Every step was a statement. Dignity over damage control. He straightened his jacket, looked Kimmel dead in the eye, and said, "You know what the saddest part is? I actually respected you. I thought you were one of the good ones. But tonight you showed me, success doesn't make everyone better. Sometimes it just gives mean people a bigger platform." The words landed like a verdict. Kimmel's eyes brimmed with tears, his composure collapsing under the glare of his own stage. He reached out one last time, broken. "Mark, please, don't leave like this." Wahlberg paused at the edge of the stage, turned back and delivered the final blow. Quiet, devastating. "Next time you try to attack someone's character, Jimmy, make sure your own can stand up to the same scrutiny." Then he walked off. No shouting, no theatrics, just the echo of his footsteps cutting through the silence. Each step stripped power from the man left behind. The cameras kept rolling. The audience didn't clap, didn't cheer, didn't move. They sat in stunned silence, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that would live far beyond television. Jimmy Kimmel sat alone at his desk, tears streaking down his face, the weight of realization pressing in. For the first time in his career, the king of late night sat without a throne, just a man exposed, fragile, undone. By the time Wahlberg's footsteps faded, the internet had already seized the moment. Clips flooded across platforms, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. The hashtag #DollarWahlberg viral exploded before the broadcast even ended. Fans called it the death of late-night arrogance. Others replayed the 34 seconds that ended an era. Hollywood went into crisis mode. Publicists texted clients, "Don't go near that desk." Executives whispered about the line Kimmel had finally crossed, the one even late-night royalty couldn't return from. Industry insiders didn't see a feud. They saw a fracture. For decades, the talk show ritual was sacred. A guest came to promote, endured the jokes, and smiled through the sting. It was a power game disguised as entertainment, but Wahlberg had refused to play. He hadn't laughed off the insult. He hadn't bowed. He'd flipped the script and in doing so reminded the world that respect mattered more than ratings. That was the true shockwave. Because if one A-lister could break the unspoken rules of late night, others could follow. And when the pawns stop playing, the kings lose their crown. In the days that followed, think pieces called it a cultural reckoning. Some labeled Wahlberg reckless, most called him brave, 34 seconds. That's all it took to turn Jimmy Kimmel from untouchable to undone. And in that moment, Mark Wahlberg redefined survival in Hollywood. Not by smiling through humiliation, but by standing tall when the world expected him to kneel. Because in the end, respect is the only currency in Hollywood that never loses its value.